thank all of you for showing up. I sure appreciate it. The fact that you're willing to hang out in this glorious new auditorium with your congressman when it's beautiful outside means you're automatically unusual. So thank you for that. Let me ask you, how many of you have been to one of my town halls before? Okay, wow, most of you, that's impressive. If you have been to one of my town halls before, you'll know I always start with a picture of my kids, in part because they're super cute. The one on that side, that's Tess. She just turned 8 years old. The one on that side, that's Sophie. She's 11. They're both at Admiral Theater Camp this week and next. Tess is in Sleeping Beauty, the musical, and is playing the evil witch. I got to watch her pretend to die the last couple nights on her bedroom floor. Sophie is Peter Pan in Shrek the musical, which I think also tells you that theater camp needs more boys. I share that with you in part because I think my kids are super cute, and in part because they're the main reason I do this job. Probably the most common question I get is, dear God, why would anyone want to be in Congress right now when it's such a mess and you've got 2 little kids? And my response is always the same. It's because it's a mess and I've got 2 little kids and I actually care about what kind of country they grow up in. Right. I think that's probably why many of you are here tonight too, and you care about our future. When I think about the future I want for my kids and for all of us, there's 2 main priorities that I have. One is trying to get this government back on track. I think I'm probably not breaking any news to let you know it's not working the way it ought to. And secondly, working to get this economy on track so that we're providing more economic opportunity in more parts of our country. So I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible so that we can get to your questions and make sure I'm hearing what's on your mind. So let me start with that first issue of trying to restore faith in our government. I'm very conscious of the fact, as still a reasonably new member of Congress, that I've joined an organization that, according to recent polling, is held in lower regard than head lice and colonoscopies. I've got a pretty good sense of why that's the case, and that was brought home to me on the very first day of this congressional session when you saw an effort to try to undermine the Office of Congressional Ethics. I want you to know I opposed that. I think it's very important that your legislative branch be held to high ethical standards. There's many members of my team who are here, and you may not know this, people who work in a congressional office are required under House rules to take annual ethics training. Interestingly enough, members of Congress are not required to take annual ethics training, and I'm actually working to change that, to change the rules of the House so that members of Congress have to take annual ethics training and have to abide by high ethical standards. When I talk about having high ethical standards for our legislative branch, I also believe we should have high ethical standards for our executive branch. Many of you may have seen in the paper reference to the fact that under current law, our president and vice president are not held to the same conflict of interest laws and standards as the rest of the executive branch. I think we ought to change that. I've sponsored a bill that would put the president and vice president under the same rules as everybody else within the executive branch. And I don't say that as a Democrat, I don't say that for partisan reasons. I say that because I think it's part of good government that no one be above the law and everybody be held to high ethical standards. I also believe that anybody who runs for the highest office in this land should have to release their tax returns so that we know that when decisions are being made, they're being made in the public interest rather than in anybody's personal financial interest. And I've sponsored a bill in that regard as well. Many of you have likely seen the news about Russian involvement in the last election. Again, I don't look at this as a Democratic or Republican issue. I think it's an American issue about protecting the integrity of our election system. I support the appointment of the special counsel, Bob Mueller, the former FBI director, and I think it's very important that he's allowed to do his job and not face interference either from Congress or from the executive branch for that matter. On top of that, I've sponsored a bill, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill, that would set up a bipartisan commission not unlike what you saw after 9/11, when you saw a bipartisan commission established to look at what exactly happened and how do we keep it, most importantly, how do we keep it from happening again? On top of that, I want to mention this last point. This hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but there's a pretty giant loophole in our campaign finance rules that allow foreign contributions to enter into our political system, in that they can make contributions to nonprofit 501c organizations that are allowed to do what's called issue advocacy that often looks quite a lot like advocacy for a political candidate. I think it's very important that we close that loophole, and I'm the main sponsor of a bill to do that. Part of restoring faith in government is actually restoring your voice and your vote within government. Unfortunately, there was a Supreme Court decision a few years back that really undermined the Voting Rights Act. And as a consequence, thankfully not really in Western Washington, but in other parts of the country, you've started to see changes in our voting system to create barriers to the ballot box. I'm the sponsor of a bill to put the teeth back into our Voting Rights Act. I think that's incredibly important. On top of that, and I'll be candid with you, I had not fully appreciated just how much trouble partisan gerrymandering is and how much it exacerbates some of the dysfunction in our nation's capital until I got to Congress and saw it firsthand. I'll tell you what I think. I think voters should choose their elected officials rather than elected officials choosing their voters. And with that in mind, I've sponsored a bill to set up a national system of nonpartisan redistricting. Not unlike what we have in this state, we have a bipartisan commission. I think pulling partisanship out of our redistricting process is very important. And then finally, I'm the sponsor of a bill that really tries to set some national standards to protect voting rights and to standardize our voting system so that there's nothing shady going on. What this chart shows is there's too much money in our politics. I think that's probably not surprising to most of you. The problem has gotten a lot worse since a Supreme Court decision known as the Citizens United decision. And as a consequence of the huge flow of money into our politics, I've sponsored a number of bills to reform our campaign finance system. The first one is a constitutional amendment to address that Citizens United decision. I will tell you, I do not believe that money is speech. I do not believe that corporations are people. And I think the Citizens United decision was very misguided, and so I've sponsored a constitutional amendment to unwind that decision. The Disclose Act is a bill that says, at the very least, when you see this dark money try to influence elections, they should have to put their name on it. We as voters should have a right to have some transparency into who is trying to influence electoral outcomes. I've also co-sponsored a bill that moves us in the direction of citizen-financed elections, get away from the deep pockets and the special interest, and put power back in the hands of all of us as citizens. And then finally, I want to talk about the FEC bill. FEC is Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission was set up after Watergate as an independent watchdog agency to blow the whistle when political candidates cheat. And it actually worked for quite some time. Unfortunately, in recent years, it's become almost as dysfunctional as Congress. And unfortunately, some of it's due to the construction of the commission. It was set up with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the commission. Would anyone like to guess how every decision of the Federal Election Commission now comes out? Literally every decision is a 3-3 stalemate. Every decision. You can Google this. This is not a joke. When they celebrated the 40th anniversary of the creation of the Federal Election Commission, this is not a joke, the commission stalemated on whether to serve bagels or donuts at the anniversary breakfast. I'm not kidding. Everyone knows the right answer was donuts. Learning about this problem, I went to work and introduced a bill to reform the Federal Election Commission. And interestingly, when we introduced that bill, it became the first bipartisan campaign finance reform bill in more than a decade. Part of having our government work better for people is having a budget process that works. Too often, our nation has functioned without a budget. Can you imagine that? Just imagine that, whether it be in Mason County, I see our commissioner here, whether that be in your families or in local businesses. Can you imagine that functioning without a budget? And yet, unfortunately, more often than not in recent years, Congress has functioned without a budget. And the ramifications of that are significant. It creates tremendous uncertainty within federal agencies. It creates tremendous uncertainty in private industry. Just to give you an example, if you stuck to the timeline that is expected, Congress would have passed a budget this spring. We're now in August, and neither the House nor the Senate has passed a budget. The fiscal year ends on the last day of September. And Congress is expected to pass out of the House and out of the Senate and have signed by the President 12 appropriations bills. So far, Congress has passed 0. And as a consequence, in the weeks to come, you're going to start to read articles in the paper about a potential government shutdown again. Now, I don't have to tell any of you in this room how damaging the last government shutdown was. We know that here in this region, when we saw furloughs at the naval base, when we saw furloughs that affected the Forest Service and its ability to get timber sales out the door, when we saw furloughs that shut down the national park for 17 days. I think that's really misguided. I feel so strongly about the need for Congress to pass a budget. I've sponsored a bill that's rather controversial in our nation's capital with some of my colleagues. It's called No Budget, No Pay. It says if members of Congress don't do their job and pass a budget, they shouldn't get paid. I gotta tell you, I haven't had a job since I was a teenager working at something that no longer exists, a video store in Port Angeles, where I got paid for a job that didn't get done. Look in the Constitution that one of the key jobs of the legislative branch is the power of the purse. Now, I want to say one more thing about this. I think it's important that Congress pass a budget. I also think it is important that that budget not be based on gimmicks. How many of you have heard of sequestration? I will admit, I had not heard of sequestration until I ran for Congress. I looked it up. It's a Latin word for stupid. And I say that in part because under the policy of sequestration, it institutes deep across the board cuts. That's a gimmick. That's a way for members of Congress not to make difficult budgeting decisions and instead to say, well, we're just going to mindlessly cut everything by the same percent. There's not a person in this auditorium would do that in your family or in your business or in your school district. And so I've been very vocal in saying Congress ought to permanently replace sequestration and get back to work passing real budgets. I will tell you, you've now seen, at least out of committee, the 12 bills, on appropriations bills within the House. They're really ugly. Unfortunately, in the conversation I had with your school district leadership, very deep cuts to K-12 and to higher ed and to workforce training. I'm very concerned about some of the cuts you've seen proposed around economic development. I was just a few days ago out in Port Angeles and visited the Composite Recycling Center, which is doing some really cool, innovative stuff, and most importantly, trying to figure out how we drive some innovation and job opportunities in rural communities. Fortunately, that Composite Recycling Center was funded through a grant from the Economic Development Administration. In the President's proposed budget, he proposes elimination of the Economic Development Administration. That's a problem, because the Economic Development Administration is really your government agency that focuses on growing jobs outside the shadow of the Space Needle. I just did a roundtable with the Chamber of Commerce up in Jefferson County, and heard one of the concerns was around small businesses that didn't have access to water or sewer. Unfortunately, the main program that provides assistance to rural communities to invest in water and school is proposed for elimination in the President's budget. I think that's very wrong-headed when we think about economic development and growing jobs. I'll just mention as well, very concerned about cuts in programs that protect clean air and clean water, even programs associated with public safety, COPS grants. I met with a fire chief earlier today who's concerned about cuts in that arena as well. So a lot of work to do in terms of trying to get this government on track, but also feel like we've got to get this economy cooking again as well. What this chart shows you is that with the exception of the very most well-off, in real dollar terms, wages have been either stagnant or going down. And that's why, this is no surprise to you in this room, that's why people are feeling pinched. People are struggling financially. And so one of my priorities is trying to figure out how do we have an economy that works better for people, where in rural communities, our top export isn't young people. How do we make sure that there's economic opportunity in every zip code? Now, I wish I could tell you, as a guy who worked professionally in economic development for a decade, that there was a silver bullet to doing that. I don't think that's true. I think it's more like silver buckshot. There's a bunch of stuff you gotta do. So let me talk and I'm not gonna talk through all this because I wanna make sure to leave time for your questions. There's a bunch of stuff you gotta do. Supporting our small businesses really, really matters. Here in Mason County, we don't have Boeing and Microsoft, we've got small businesses. And so making sure that we're making the investments that help small, and having their back, and sometimes getting out of their way so that they can succeed, I think is really important. Workforce development, the work that the school district does around education and training, things like career and technical education really, really matters in terms of our ability to grow jobs. According to the International Economic Development Council, the #1 factor businesses use in making their location decisions is the availability of good skilled workers. Infrastructure matters. How many of you have driven through Gorst or on Interstate 5 anytime recently? I am not sure about you. I'm pretty sure that the speed limit signs are only there for nostalgic purposes. And listen, that's not just a pain in the neck to all of us as people who sit in traffic. That impedes our economic growth as well. And so making sure that we're making smart investments in infrastructure matters. Tax reform matters. I think we should have a tax code that encourages investments in the United States of America rather than someplace else. And so having a tax code that works better for small businesses here in Mason County has to happen. And it's one of the areas where I think you could see potentially a bipartisan path forward on tax reform. I want to mention this last point too. Protecting our seniors really matters to me as well. Unfortunately, we've seen some proposals that would really undermine Medicare and Social Security. I'm concerned about that, and part of my job is both playing offense and defense on Medicare and Social Security.
All right.
I'm not going to run through all these. I'm working on a bunch of stuff that's focused on trying to grow jobs and grow opportunity in our region. I'll mention just a couple. I was just chatting with the school district leadership about access to high-speed internet. Even though we're just a stone's throw away from Microsoft and Amazon, unfortunately, the Washington 6th Congressional District ranks in the bottom 1/5 in the country when it comes to access to high-speed internet. That's a problem. That's a problem for our kids when it comes to their educational opportunity. That's a problem for small businesses in terms of their ability to compete. One of the ways we overcome geographic remoteness is through technology. And so I'm about to introduce, and probably in the September-October timeframe, a bill that's focused on trying to expand access to high-speed internet. In addition, we're working on a number of things focused on our natural resource-based industries and trying to drive more opportunities in communities that have been historically disadvantaged. Some of that's through the tax code, trying to encourage investment in areas that have high unemployment. Some of it's things like the Timber Collaborative that we've been working on to have the timber industry and the conservation community at the same table, trying to work through how we actually increase harvest levels in our federal forests, but do it in a responsible way that works both for community economic health and for forest health too. So we're working on a number of things on that front. Want to do 2 quick public service announcements before I open it up to questions. Half of our staff in the district, in our district office, does what we call casework. Casework is if someone's grappling with a federal agency, we go to work for them. We just had an example a little while back where there was a small business in Port Angeles that was waiting on a tax return, and they waited almost 2 years to get their money from the IRS. And they called us and they said, this is presenting a cash flow problem for us. And so we worked with them, and it shouldn't take a call from your member of Congress to the IRS, but it worked. And within a week or two, they were able to get their tax return. I'll give you another example. And some of it's the coolest work we get to do. Probably the most work we do in our region is with the VA. And we had a guy reach out to our office and said, I got shot up on a mission when I was in the Vietnam War. And he said, I still never got my Purple Heart. And he said, in part because I was on a mission in Laos, and according to the federal government, we were never in Laos. And so we worked with that guy, and we got his mission declassified. And probably the coolest day I've had in this job was getting to pin a Purple Heart to that guy's chest. And I tell you that in part because we can't solve problems we don't know about. So if you have an issue with Social Security or IRS or immigration or OPM or you name it, please reach out to us. And most importantly, if you can be our eyes and ears, I'd be grateful for that too. I want to make a quick, we got a bunch of cards out there if you want to get the information for our office. I think I heard you ask what the phone number is. We do an email newsletter every 2 weeks just to let folks know the good, the bad, and the ugly of what's going on back there. And we send it out on Mondays. I was asked at one of my town halls whether we sell your email address or share it with anybody. We don't. Your secret is safe with us. And with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions. We'd love to hear what's on your minds and answer whatever questions you all have. We only have 2 rules when it comes to the Q&A session. One, if you have a lengthy thing to read, I get to spend a lot of time in cars and airplanes, and so if you have something to read, just hand it to us, and I'm happy to read it. Just out of respect to the other people who have questions, I want to make sure we keep everybody kind of tight. 2, use Jeopardy rules. If you can frame it as a question, that's always helpful. And the final thing I'm going to say is, when we hit our witching hour at 7 o'clock, I'm going to ask for your understanding. This may be one of the few nights this week that I have a chance of seeing my kids awake, so I am probably going to dash out of here. If we don't get to your question, we have cards out there. Email me. My commitment to you is I will email you back. All right? Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you for your recent joining of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus in the House of Representatives. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. And I'm wondering what aspect of the climate problem gives you the greatest concern for the 6th District, and what aspect of the Solutions Caucus appeals to you the most?
Thank you. So the reference was to something called the Climate Solutions Caucus, which has been somewhat tongue-in-cheek referred to as the Noah's Ark Caucus, not just because of the potential for biblical floods, but because you can only join that caucus in pairs, one Democrat and one Republican. And it's focused on trying to address issues surrounding climate change. You asked about my concerns. A lot of my concerns are parochial. I represent 11 Native American tribes. 4 of them are coastal tribes that, as we sit in this auditorium, are in the process of trying to move to higher ground because of persistent flooding, more severe storms, rising sea levels, not to mention the threat of tsunami. One of the most compelling experiences I've had as your representative was going down to Taholah, down in Grace Harbor County, with the president of the Quinault Indian Nation. That's where the lower reservation is. And she said, when I was a kid, the ocean was a football field length away, and now it's our front porch. She said, every time we have a severe storm, it breaches our seawall. And our village was built below sea level, so it just fills up like a bowl. And so they're trying to move their tribe to higher ground. And that's tough because that's really expensive. I had a similar experience out with the Quileute out in the Push, where anyone in this room could stand at their Head Start facility and throw a rock once, maybe twice, and land it in the Pacific Ocean. They've seen persistent flooding. So I'm concerned about that and looking at how we mitigate those impacts to people who are already feeling the impacts of climate change is a priority for me. I'll give you another example that's near and dear to Mason County, and that's our shellfish growers. There are 3,200 people in our region whose livelihoods are tied to growing shellfish. And unfortunately, they too are already seeing the impacts of climate change. The Seattle Times, I think, did a very good series looking at how climate change is affecting the ability of oysters to grow shells. And in fact, we've seen some of our growers start setting up operations like over in Hawaii because they're dealing with changes to ocean chemistry. I'm concerned about that. I've actually sponsored a bipartisan bill to try to address this issue of ocean acidification. I'm the lead sponsor on it, but Jamie Herrera Butler, who represents down in southern Washington, is also a sponsor on that bill because she understands as well that our shellfish growers and our fisheries are really impacted by changing ocean chemistry. So that bill would try to drive additional federal research and federal attention to addressing ocean acidification. But listen, there's a long list of things. You know, our Defense Department says that climate change is a threat multiplier. And I'm concerned at the direction that the new administration has taken. I think climate change is real and that we need to do something about it. Other nations have acknowledged that. Unfortunately, with President Trump pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accord, we joined just two countries, Nicaragua and Syria, as the only nations not party to that accord. And listen, other nations have acknowledged that there's economic opportunity in trying to work towards renewable energy and smart grid technology. And, you know, having worked in economic development, I can tell you, they always say good economic development is like good hockey. Wayne Gretzky famously said, the best players don't skate to where the puck is, they skate to where the puck is going to be. And there's huge economic opportunity in this, and I worry that our nation, if it doesn't wake up, is going to miss that boat.
Yes, thank you for taking my question.
Yeah, you bet.
And my question is, what will you do to protect the social safety net, specifically SNAP and Medicaid, during upcoming tax discussions, and make sure that the process is revenue neutral? And how might we help you in terms of reaching across the aisle?
Thanks. I share your concern about the social safety net, and I say that in part because of what we've seen already both out of the House budget and out of the budget from the President. You know, very deep cuts to the social safety net, an effort to block grant Medicaid in a way that would basically reduce healthcare opportunities for low-income people, for poor people. The significant portion of people on Medicaid are kids and people with disabilities and the elderly, and so I'm very concerned about that. On top of that, you've seen proposals, you know, and I shared this with the superintendent, you know, things that show up in your classrooms here in the Mason School District. You know, one of the proposals was to, you know, this sounds wonky, but one of the proposals in the President's budget was to eliminate something called LIHEAP. LIHEAP is the Low-Income Housing Heating and Energy Assistance Program, acronyms. That's a really wonky way of saying that's a program that helps people pay their heating bills in the winter so that they don't lose their house or have their power turned off. You know, eliminating that program would have real implications to people here in Mason County, and I'm concerned about that. And so part of our effort is, one, to shine a light on the value of some of those investments and how they enable us to let people live with dignity. Part of that is, as you mentioned, working to make sure that if and when Congress takes up tax reform, it isn't done in a way that completely undermines the social safety net. I'm concerned about what we've seen in terms of the broad brushstrokes from the House leadership about what tax reform might look like, in that it will blow a giant hole in our deficit and our debt. I think the debt's a problem, and I think providing a massive tax break primarily to the wealthiest Americans doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think the wealthiest Americans need much of a tax break. I think middle-class families could use a break. And I'm worried that that will be used as a way simply to pull the rug out from under people, because after giving a giant tax break, they'll say, we have no money to fund the social safety net. So I wish I could give you a strong sense of how all of that's going to play out. I think it's really important, if you as a citizen care about that you make sure your voice is heard and that you're reaching out to your local representative, and I'm glad that you did that.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Sokroff, and I live here in Belfair, and I'm a substitute teacher, and I support your work in encouraging students. I support your work in the environment, but I most strongly object to your recent vote for nearly $700 billion for an already bloated defense bill. That includes 100 million for nuclear weapons. When you know that education, housing, healthcare, EPA, CDC, food for the poor, and other peaceful programs are being drastically cut, how could you justify that vote? And also, I'm very concerned that you put your energy behind the United Nations. 122 nations of the world voted to rid the world of weapons of mass destruction that is demanded by the Nuremberg Principles and the UN Charter, which we are signatories of. Would you please make sure that we do not use nuclear weapons again?
Thanks for your question. And I'll say full-throatedly, one of the things that I've been working on as a member of Congress is to make sure that we uphold our commitment to the treaties that we've signed on to, including some of the efforts to reduce our nuclear stockpiles. So the short answer to the last question is yes. I think it's very important that we avoid a nuclear war. Obviously, there is a deterrent factor in having a strong military, but I also believe that not every problem can be solved by a bomb in a tank. And it's part of the reason I've been an advocate for smart power. The notion that you have to have a strong military because there are threats that exist, but not every problem can be solved with a strong military. You have to have things like diplomacy and economic policies, including economic sanctions that we're using right now with North Korea and with Russia and with Iran. Foreign assistance is part of that foreign policy toolbox. So that's part of the way we hopefully address the issue that you raised. You made reference to an authorizing bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. And I agree with the need to first stop cutting funding for good programs that are helping people. I agree with that. And I also agree that where there's wasteful spending in the defense budget, it should be cut. And one of the problems as you look at not the authorizing side, but at the appropriation side and the budgeting side, one of my concerns about, and I don't say this in a partisan way, I don't think they would argue this point, we've heard and we've seen from the Trump administration a desire to increase defense spending dramatically, cut the bejeebers out of everything else, and cut taxes for very wealthy people. I reject that. I reject that approach. The reality is, if we focused on growing our economy and having a tax code where the most well-off actually pay their fair share, we could actually make sure our troops get a pay increase, which is part of the reason I supported that bill, to make sure that they have the equipment and training that they need, both for them to be safe, but also to keep us safe. And make sure we do right by those who serve. Now, I'll also mention just a couple other kind of technicalities with the bill, and why, and I'll be honest with you, sometimes bills are in that gray area where you have to hold your nose and vote yes or hold your nose and vote no. There were some things in that bill that I fought really hard for, and I'll give you a few examples. One, right now, if you are an employee of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and you get sent overseas to work on the forward deployed carrier in Japan, it actually takes an act of Congress to make sure that if you work overtime, you get paid overtime. Interestingly enough, that act of Congress was in the bill that you just referenced, making sure that our workforce at the Naval Shipyard get paid overtime when they work overtime. Similarly, you probably followed in the paper, the Defense Department made some changes with regard to how our defense workers, our civilian and our uniformed defense workers, get reimbursed for travel. And unfortunately, it's had a really negative impact on Kitsap County and on the workers at Naval Base Kitsap. What it said was, if you travel for more than 30 days, they cut your per diem by 25%. If you travel for more than 180 days, they cut your per diem by 45%. Now, I think that's really shameful because the consequence of it is that you have people having to pay out of pocket. You've got people who are literally, there's folks who are going down to work in San Diego at the shipyard down there that are staying in Tijuana because they can't find a safe and affordable place to stay. And so I introduced a bill to unwind that, that policy from the Defense Department. That bill was included in the National Defense Authorization Act that you just referenced. I'll give one other quick example. Again, you may have followed this in the Kitsap Sun. There's a 50s era law that says if you are a military veteran and you want to go to work for the Defense Department, you have to wait 6 months before you apply for a job at the Defense Department. Now that, I think initially was intended so that very senior members of the military couldn't create jobs for themselves, and I understand that and you can see how that could be abused. Since 9/11, that 50s era rule has been waived first by President George W. Bush and then by President Barack Obama, so that if someone served in the military, they could apply immediately for a job with the Defense Department. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because the largest employer in our region is the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. So in a community like ours, where I represent more military veterans than any Democrat in Congress, when someone leaves the military, if you told them you have to wait 6 months, what you're telling them is Navy veterans cannot apply to work at the largest employer in our region for 6 months. And there was an article in the Kitsap Sun, if you haven't read it, you should, that told that a guy who had an offer to work at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. He was on a submarine, he retired from the Navy, and he got an offer from the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. When President Trump took office, that waiver of that rule expired and has not been re-implemented. And what that meant to that guy, and he said this in the paper, was, why should I have to be unemployed for 6 months before I can take a job that I'm qualified for? So I introduced a bill that said, let's put that waiver back into effect. Let's make sure that if you serve this country, we have your back. That you don't have to be unemployed 6 months before you get a job at the largest employer in Kitsap County, or for that matter, the largest employer in Pierce County, Joint Base Lewis McChord. We put in some protections to make sure that it couldn't be abused. That bill was included in the National Defense Authorization Act that you referenced. So there's the rub. I agree with your general point that we shouldn't cut the bejeebers out of everything, and that we should also work to root out waste within the Defense Department. I guess I just came to a conclusion that as you measure the puts and the takes, it augured for my yes vote. And you may come to a different conclusion, but at least I want to give you the straight scoop on why I voted the way I did.
Yes, Mr. Kilmer, you voted no on House Resolution 3004, known as Kate's Law. You also voted no on House Resolution 3003, the No Sanctuary for Criminals Act. I receive your emails all the time. You talk about accountability. Right? The word ownership goes along with accountability. Jill Sundberg was murdered in Grant County, Washington, December 21st of last year by 5 illegal aliens. She was shot 13 times in the head. That means she looked like a squashed tomato. She had 4 sons. They pinned a sign to her back referencing the Gulf drug cartel. But yet you voted no on 2 bills to protect American citizens against these exact type of people. Will you own that? That is accountability. And will you look her 4 sons in the eyes and say that illegal aliens have more of a right to be in this country than their mother had a right to life?
So this is a good example of why Congress should work better. It's an example of why when a bill is introduced, it should get a hearing and should be subject to amendment. So let's talk about case law as an example of that. Unfortunately, that bill neither got a hearing nor was subject to an amendment. Listen, I support the notion that if you are in this country illegally and commit violent crimes, you have no business being in our country. I think everybody agrees with that notion. And in fact, I've sponsored legislation that says if you want to stay in this country, you have to pass a criminal background check. So to your latter question, the answer is I agree with you that if someone is a violent offender, they don't have any business being in our country. Now here's the problem. When you have a bill that didn't get a hearing and it wasn't subject to an amendment, It includes things that they probably didn't intend to have included in it. So, for example, under that bill, as written, it meant that if you were an American citizen who who'd offered assistance to someone at the border who might be in having a health issue or what have you, you were subject to a felony. If you were an American citizen, not, as you point out, a violent offender, you were subject to a felony conviction under that bill as written. I don't think that was probably what the authors intended, but because the bill wasn't subject to a hearing or subject to amendment, that language stayed in the bill. Similarly, if you were a victim of human trafficking, who willfully presented yourself at the border seeking refuge, you were subject to felony, to prison time, for willingly presenting yourself at the border as a victim of sexual violence or of human trafficking. I mean, I guess I would turn the question around. Does anyone think that's a smart policy? No one thinks that's a smart policy, and yet, because the bill was not subjected to a hearing or made open to amendment, that was what was in the bill that you referenced. So, again, listen, this is why people hate Congress, right? When bills are put forward, not to make a law, but to make a political point, it's disheartening and it undermines people's faith in their government.
Hi. The question I have for you is, the defense budget being the largest outpouring of money, is there a way of taking a look at some of the procurement items and have them reduced so that some of those dollars could be saved for other things such as education or for the Medicaid or Medicare program? In other words, how many airplanes do we really truly need to purchase that cost $1 billion a piece? Or how many more aircraft carriers do we need? Or how many more submarines do we need?
Sure.
My major question is, why do we have airplanes being purchased for the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force?
Right. So there's really two questions at play there. One is what we buy, and two is how we buy it. So let me start on what we buy. One of our problems is Congress, not unlike the gentleman's question in the back. Oftentimes, Congress will buy things that the Defense Department doesn't even say it needs. You know, a good example of that was a few years back. You likely saw this in the paper where the Defense Department, where Congress added in a very substantial purchase of Abrams tanks when the Defense Department said, we already have more Abrams tanks than we can handle. And why did that happen? Well, because the primary manufacturer was in a district in Ohio that just happened to be the district of the Speaker of the House. That's a problem. You know, in part, and I say that because it's a zero-sum game, right? There's only so much money, and if you buy a bunch of stuff that the Defense Department says it doesn't need, that comes at the expense of buying things that they say they need to make sure that those who serve our country are made safe and can keep us safe. Another example of that, and this is more controversial, is the Base Realignment and Closure Commission process. The Defense Department has said we are overbuilt, that we have more bases, both domestically and around the world, than they can handle. And as a consequence, they have to maintain bases that they say, you know, one, don't necessarily hold strategic value, and two, come at a cost. You know, the money they spend to try to reinforce bases that they say they don't need comes at the cost of buying equipment or providing training for service members, or for doing something else, as you point out. Every year, for the 4.5 years that I've been in Congress, the Defense Department has asked, please let us at least plan for a Base Realignment and Closure Commission. And every year, Congress has put language in the defense bill prohibiting them from even thinking about it. Now, Listen, when you hear about a Race Realignment and Closure Commission, it certainly causes everyone in this region to gulp a little bit, because Naval Base Kitsap is the largest employer in our region. Joint Base Lewis McChord is the largest employer in Pierce County. The good news is, if there is a Base Realignment and Closure Commission, I actually think we're very well positioned. That's not to say we should rest on our laurels, and in fact, I'm working on a bunch of stuff to try to improve our competitiveness if there is a background. But it does suggest that we have to, we should allow them to at least move forward with a commission. We are well positioned geographically. We are well positioned in terms of our capabilities. What Puget Sound Naval Shipyard does, no one else can do. And so we're well positioned in that regard. So there was a vote on an amendment to the defense bill that was referenced earlier to say, let's allow them to at least plan for a background. I supported that amendment and it failed. So that's the what do we buy part of the conversation. The second part is how do we buy it? And that's something that I've actually worked on quite a bit. You know, let's use technology as an example. The Defense Department buys a bunch of technology, and often will develop it from scratch in a way that's incredibly expensive. The reality is, you know, think about cloud computing as an example. There are private vendors who have kind of figured out how to do cloud computing in a way that's probably better than what the Defense Department can cook up and is clearly secure. We have financial institutions and others that use commercial cloud solutions. And yet, the Defense Department has sort of eschewed using commercial options. That's something that I've worked on, to actually work to have the Defense Department, and frankly some other agencies too, use some of the commercial offerings rather than just inventing stuff from scratch that's already been invented. You made the point around acquisition of large-scale equipment. Same idea. There is some value in, rather than stovepipe purchasing by each department, the Department of Army, Department of Navy, Air Force, actually having some collaboration between those agencies. And that's something I've worked on as well. So I think it's a good and fair question.
My Indivisible group recently met with Tim Sheldon, and he shared with us that he's promoting these mini nuclear reactors to be around out here. And I just wondered what green technology do you see as viable solutions to meet the energy needs out here?
Yeah. We're already seeing a substantial amount of renewables in our state. We've seen a pretty substantial expansion of wind, of solar. I don't know a lot about the what you refer to as the mini reactors that Senator Sheldon referenced. I can't really speak to that as well. Listen, one of the things that we have going for us in Western Washington is the Bonneville Power Administration and the use of hydro that we've had historically. That is renewable. It also puts us in a good position in terms of being able to access reliable power and cheap power. One of the things I'm very concerned about was in the president's budget, he proposed selling off the Bonneville Power Administration's transmission. That would automatically increase the power rates that every one of you as ratepayers pay. If you talk to Mason PUD, and I have, they're very concerned about privatizing that Bonneville Power Administration because of the implications it would have to all of you as ratepayers here in Mason County. And so as we look at priorities in terms of, and thankfully, that is something that you've seen Democrats and Republicans within the Northwest all agree that's a bad idea because it would absolutely hammer economically the people we represent and our competitiveness when it comes to our local businesses.
Thank you so much for coming to Belfair.
You bet.
I'm glad to see that you support the Voter Empowerment Act. How do you feel about the proposal that all ballots be paper ballots across the nation so that our voting machines can't be hacked?
I think at the very least, there should be a auditable paper trail for all voting, period. I guess I should keep my answer shorter.
Hi, welcome to Belfair.
Thanks.
I travel about an hour to and from work, one way. And I purposely bought a energy efficient car so that I could save on gas mileage, but also reduce my carbon footprint. Unfortunately, it's been ongoing talk for about 2 years now. Oregon took some volunteers for the tax per mile initiative down there, where because of all of the hybrid cars and energy efficient, fuel efficient cars that people are buying, they're not making the money off of the pumps anymore. And now they're planning on bringing it up to Washington State. I'm taxed enough already, and driving an hour to work to take care of the seniors that I do in my assisted living center, it's very concerning to me that we would do this and that the state would push to do something like this. Also, I don't want anything in my car tracking me. I'm sorry, but I love my privacy, and I don't need the state holding my hand as I'm driving down the road. So what are your thoughts on this? Have you heard anything more of it? And will you vote no?
I haven't seen the specifics proposal, so it's hard to say in terms of, I always like to read the specifics before saying how I vote on something. I can tell you, I know, what I have heard about it is, I think the state DOT or perhaps the Puget Sound Regional Council is doing some sort of a pilot study to look at this concept that you mentioned. I think it's known as like vehicle miles traveled. And the notion is trying to, as you point out, shift the cost away from having it be a pay at the pump toward looking at how many miles you drive on a road. I have a lot of questions about it. Among those questions is how it affects rural communities. You know, we drive a long distance to get from place to place in rural areas. And so it's unclear to me whether that would, and I fear that that would disadvantage rural communities. Listen, I grew up on the Olympic Peninsula, so I'm concerned about that. That's one of the things that I would want to look at if there is a proposal in that regard. I haven't seen anything proposed at that, in that vein at the federal level. There is and has been a conversation regarding infrastructure at the federal level. I think that's important that you actually see the federal government step up and be a better partner to local communities when it comes to investment in infrastructure, rather than having that cost burden borne just by Mason County or by the taxpayers of the state of Washington. I would add that the idea that probably has the most traction in Washington, D.C. when it comes to transportation investment is a proposal to repatriate income that's currently being held by corporations overseas, to repatriate those dollars and dedicate it to infrastructure investment. That's something that you've seen proposed both by Democrats and Republicans, and I think at least in the near term could be an opportunity to make substantial infrastructure investment in a way that frankly doesn't cost you as a taxpayer more money, rather brings home dollars that corporations are currently banking overseas.
One thing that's bothered me forever is I consider that our legislature, Congress, senators, they're an elite class of people. They are not truly the average American. I think what they need to do is do away with their special benefits of medical benefits. They should have the same benefits and retirement benefits as all other federal workers. They are not federal workers. They need support from the government.
I generally believe that people who represent you should play by the same rules that you do, period. When it comes to healthcare, and you can Google this, Members of Congress and the people who work for members of Congress are subject to the same laws that you are. Our staff and members of Congress buy insurance through the exchange under the Affordable Care Act. It's actually slightly worse than what you get to buy, in part because members of Congress and their staff are required to buy through the Washington, D.C. exchange. You can imagine that's a little bit complicated because healthcare providers in this region aren't necessarily on the radar screen of insurance carriers in our nation's capital. So that's challenging. I also don't think that members of Congress should have any special deal when it comes to retirement. I can tell you, you can look online and see what my compensation is. You can see what our retirement system is. There's a lot of things that aren't true on the internet with regard to what members of Congress get paid and their pension. And I don't say this in complaining. I'm not doing this job for the pay and benefits. I'm doing it because I care about the community that I represent. When you go through freshman orientation, they started orientation by saying, for those of you who believe that on your first day you get to retire with your full pay, that's not true. In fact, I've only been in Congress for 4.5 years. At this point, as we sit here, I am still not eligible for retirement through the federal system. It's not until I've been there for 5 years that I'm even eligible for any retirement. So, and again, I don't say that complaining, but I just want to give you the reality of what we are and aren't eligible for. Your broader point, which is that those who represent us shouldn't get any special deals, I agree with that.
Hi, my name is Colleen Walls. I've been attending all PUD3 commission meetings since January in regard to the smart meter that PUD3 wants to install on Mason County homes and businesses without transparency, letting folks know what they're doing. Those who do know and want to opt out will be charged a $50 a month opt-out fee. This grid modernization program, according to James Woolsey, former NSA director, says the smart grid is the stupidest thing that could be going on right now. And then onto your bill regarding high-speed internet to rural areas, have no worries. PUD3 recently passed a resolution here in Mason County. They will be putting fiber optics out through the entire county, known as what's called fiber hoods. 75% of each neighborhood must agree to this because what they will be doing is charging $25 a month for 12 years to be part of this broadband program. But my main concern is the Mason PUD3 putting smart meters with 2 radio transmitters in each meter on our home, transmitting radio frequencies, as well as these things have eavesdropping capabilities and surveillance capabilities. And I think everybody in Mason County really needs to know about this stuff, and everybody needs to opt out. But again, there's this $50 opt-out fee a month that Mason PUD3 wants to charge us. And then, not only that, they want to remove our analog meters and place what they call a radio off meter on my property, which still has a problem with the switch mode power supply, which emits anywhere from 60 hertz to 60,000 hertz high transient voltages into the wiring of my home. And I happen to have, I've done a ton of research on these smart meters since January. And as I said, I've attended every PUD3 meeting. What are your thoughts on smart meters being placed on our homes and businesses without our knowledge? And then when we do have knowledge, they want to charge us $50 a month.
I hadn't seen the proposal that you're referring to, and I'd love to get your information, and maybe since it sounds like you've spent a lot of time on this, maybe we can get some more information from you. On the other point around access to high-speed internet, while Mason PUD may have proposals in that regard, there's a bunch of places that I represent where there's not really a plan for how you get people access to high-speed internet. I'll share another story. I can't remember. I did share this with the superintendent. I was out in Neah Bay, and we met with the chair of the Makah tribe, former chair now. And he said, "Do you want the good news or the bad news?" I said, "Tell me the good news." He said, "Every one of our high school seniors graduated this year." All right. I said, "That's fantastic, right? 100% graduation." It's been a while since I've been in a math class, but I think 100% is pretty dang good. And then I said, so what's the bad news? He said, well, this year, for the first time, the state of Washington is requiring that students take the state mandated exam over the internet. He said, Derek, we don't have high-speed internet. He said, we took a sample test at school. We shut down every computer in the school, he said, and we took a sample test. And it's one of those where you like go through 10 questions and then click next page. He said, we timed it. It took 1 minute and 44 seconds to get to the next page. He said, so that's not going to work. He said, so we're talking about busing our kids probably to Port Angeles, having them take the exam in a school they've never been in. You know, and you start to worry that that's, you know, that starts to create some equity issues around what kind of opportunities those kids have. So the bill, to get specific about what we're talking about doing, is primarily using the tax code. So that, you know, part of the challenge right now is if you're CenturyLink, it doesn't really pencil for you to lay pipe out to Needham Bay. And so looking at whether within the tax code, you can try to encourage at least the extension of high-speed internet to more of the very geographically remote places, not just in our region, but around the country. And we've shared that with the PUD Association and with private industry and with others, and there seems to be a lot of support for that idea. But we will happily send you a draft of what we're working on, and maybe you might have some input on that too.
Yes, I was wondering if you would ever consider passing a law that prescription drugs ads don't need to be on TV. It costs the taxpayers, it makes drugs more expensive.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that would pass First Amendment, but as someone who, particularly on football Sundays, I'd love to blow up some of those ads. Let me talk to your broader point, though. I think there's, you know, and we've seen some really outrageous examples of prescription drug prices going through the roof. In fact, I joined some of my colleagues in sending a letter to one of the CEOs of one of those companies where you saw this massive increase in the cost for insulin injection, because we heard from so many of our constituents that have diabetes who said, gosh, this is just crippling to us financially. There are some things that government, I'm not sure if it can do what you're asking, but there are some things that you're seeing contemplated. I'll give you a quick example. Right now, one of the ways that we reduce costs in the pharmaceutical arena is when something transitions to generic. Within the Food and Drug Administration, there's a 3-year backlog on approval of generics. What that means is there's the 3-year backlog on you being able to save more money on pharmaceuticals. So we've got to push to try to get through that backlog so that we can reduce those costs. There's even been, and again, I haven't seen the specifics of this idea, but I think there's potential in this. Right now, I'll use an analogy. In the financial services arena, there's an agency that's called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that basically has your back as it's another acronym, I had to think through it for a second, that has your back to make sure that Wall Street banks don't mess you over and to provide you protections. You know, there's systems in place to make sure that, you know, they don't put stuff in your meat and that they don't pollute your water. But there had not been protections for your personal finances, and we saw how that played out a few years ago when we saw a massive meltdown where people were abused by the financial system. And so there was put in place an agency to look at that. There has been some discussion at looking at setting up something at least to be an oversight watchdog around prescription drug pricing. And the potential value of that is it has the potential to look across the value chain. You know, there are some instances where the problem is the drug company. There are examples where the problem may be a supplier to the drug company or a pharmacy benefit manager or someone else along the supply chain. And so having a more thorough look at the problem, I think, could hold some potential. Hello.
Derek, you were very kind in meeting with myself. I'm John Campbell. I'm on the school board, and this is my colleague, Art Whiteman. And I would like you to share with our constituents a question that your excellent answer to a question I posed. As you recall, I asked you that my main concern was an attempt by certain people high up in the government to substitute private education for public education, such as we enjoy in this place and such as has had the support of our constituents to build this place. Do I suffer from paranoia in the concern that there are people that would like to privatize public education in schools that perform no better and sometimes worse than public ones? Or am I making too much of that?
I wish I could tell you you were paranoid. I can't say that. I'll say up front, I believe public dollars should be for public education.
Here, here.
And you're not wrong to be concerned about that. Unfortunately, in the president's budget, he proposed pulling $1 billion out of what's called Title I, which goes to make sure that school districts like this one can provide educational opportunity to poor kids and put those dollars into private vouchers. I oppose that. And listen, I'll just say a couple other things. One, I just want to thank you for what you do with the school directors and our superintendent. And I say that I worked in economic development professionally. The number one factor, according to the International Economic Development Council, the number one factor that businesses use when they make their location decisions is the availability of good, skilled, educated workers. So if you care about unemployment, you should care about public education, because what you do matters in terms of our ability to grow jobs here. If you care about income inequality, you should care about education, because study after study suggests that as educational attainment goes up, so do wages. I'll give you another statistic. The most recent statistic that I saw said that in our state, if you're a high school dropout, you're 17% of our state's population, and you're 55% of our state's prison population. I don't know about the rest of you. I would much rather invest on the front end in educating our kids than on the back end in employment and kids. And that's the decision that we make as a society. I'm very concerned by the budget that we saw produced both by the president and by House leadership when it comes to educational investment, because you saw very deep cuts both to the Title I program for poor kids. You saw deep cuts in professional development, teacher training programs. I think that's wrong-headed as well to cut in that area. You saw proposed cuts to after-school and before-school programs that would, in the president's budget, would end those services for 1.6 million students in our country. I think that's a bad idea. When we're asking our kids to say no to a whole lot of stuff, we gotta give them stuff to say yes to, and some of those after-school programs are one of the few things that provide them with something to say yes to. So I think that would be a mistake as well. Sadly, the cuts aren't only focused in K-12. There's also very substantial cuts proposed in career and technical education, both in K-12 and in higher ed. You know, listen, shop class matters. Making sure that when someone graduates from high school, either they're ready for college or ready for work, really matters. And unfortunately, the president's budget included a 15% cut to career and technical education programs. That's shop classes. That's programs that actually can lead to a job down the road. In the higher ed arena, you've seen some really scary proposals around cuts to financial aid. And this is personal to me because as the son of a school teacher, I got lots of financial aid to be able to go to college. I got all of it. I got grants and I got loans and I washed dishes in the college dining room, which my wife believes is the main skill I learned in college. But I'll tell you, how many of you have heard of Pell Grants? All right, Pell Grants are grant-based assistance to students who are middle class or poorer off. In both the president's budget and in the House proposed spending proposal, they flatlined Pell Grants. What's not flatlined is tuition. And so that's increasing the burden on students. The president has proposed ending the Perkins Loan Program and the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Now, the Perkins Loan Program, what that does is, one, it provides a better rate than a kid could get from a private lender. And two, it means that when you go to college, you can avoid accruing interest while you're still in school. I don't know why we would pull the plug on that. The president's budget proposes a $500 million cut to federal work study. I think that's also very misguided. You know, I look at education as the door to opportunity, and for a lot of families, including mine, financial aid is the key to that door. And I don't think your federal government should say it's going to hide the key. I'll just end with this note. You know, 2.5 centuries ago, Benjamin Franklin in his Poor Richard's Almanac wrote, "An investment in knowledge pays the greatest interest." I think that was true when he wrote it, and I think that remains true today. And part of our challenge is to make sure that your federal government walks that walk.
All right.
Hi, Congressman Cameron Gwaltson, and this is a nice piggyback off of the information you just shared in regards to challenges with the budget and appropriations for AmeriCorps, National Service, and so that, you know, earn it type of opportunity, as well as VISTA programs and VITA and EITC programs. All of those, in effect, are part of economic development. They're helping people be able to keep money locally, get work experience. So how are you working with your members of Congress to let them know this is an investment that reaps dividends and it's smart business to continue these programs and maybe up the ante a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. This is unfortunately another area where the president's budget eliminated AmeriCorps, eliminated the national service programs. And this gets at the question that I can't remember if it was you or someone who asked about that earlier around. It affects not only economic development, as you mentioned, but also our social safety net. You know, Kitsap Community Resources has a lot of AmeriCorps volunteers. The American Red Cross has a lot of AmeriCorps participants. And it's a win-win. It's a win for the communities in which those AmeriCorps participants serve, because they're helping to build resiliency within the community. It's a win for those participants because they're having extraordinary experiences, and it helps them defray the cost of college so that they can avoid college debt if that's the path they choose to take. And so to me, it's a terrific program. Here's the good news. There's, I think, bipartisan consensus in Congress that the president's proposal is wrong-headed in that regard. And so I don't think you're going to see an elimination of AmeriCorps funding. You asked about the earned income tax credit. I think that's also really good public policy, you know, in that it, particularly for the lowest income earners, it helps make work pay. It's a tax credit for work, for working, for people who qualify as working poor, what's called working poor. And I've actually supported expanding the earned income tax credit because, again, if you want to have people work rather than be on welfare, then work has to pay more than welfare.
Hello. My question is, are you aware of what happened over the past couple of months down at Evergreen State College?
Yeah, sure. Just what I read in the paper.
Okay. With that said, you talk about budget cuts and funding K through 12. Couldn't we take the almost $600 million that we give to Evergreen State College a year and give it to K through 12? And just let them go and do whatever they want down there? Since they're not acting on behalf of most of us in this state anyhow?
Well, that's probably a better question for state legislators because their funding primarily comes from the state budget. The federal government's role when it comes to higher ed is really in two areas. One, financial aid to students, and that is without regard to whether it's a public institution or a private institution. And secondly, it's focused on research. support for research at our institutions of higher education.
First of all, you gave an answer just a little while ago about a tank plant that they wanted to keep, you know. Well, you left off a very important issue, I think, and that's the only tank plant the United States has. And the thought is, if we close the tank plant and we need to build tanks, it's going to take a long time to get that going. So that's a very major issue that you kind of skipped over. And also, I'd like for you, you talked about Kate's Law, and I'd like for you to explain to me, I understood Kate's Law as a law that increased the penalties for people that had been kicked out of the country and came back in. And if that's the case, how does that affect those two categories you said?
Read the bill.
Yeah. I mean, or have the people that seek asylum, have they already been kicked out of the country and now they're seeking asylum? Is that what you're saying?
I would just encourage you to both read the bill and read the analysis of the bill that suggests that because of the way it was written, you know, and again, this is why bills should have a public hearing. You know, and I think, listen, I don't think that's a Democratic or Republican idea, the notion that when a bill is introduced, it should receive a public hearing and have testimony on it so that these sorts of concerns can be vetted and addressed rather than having bills that really end up just making a political point rather than actually trying to address a legitimate problem. And I can send you the language of the bill and the independent assessments that have backed up the notion that it would cause those problems that I mentioned in my prior response. And on the Abrams tank thing, certainly the concerns around the industrial base are legitimate. You know, there are examples of that. I guess the argument that I would respond with is it's a zero-sum game. At some point, if we're buying things that the Defense Department says, you know, what they said was, we have more Abrams tanks than we can possibly use right now. And at some point, if you buy a bunch of stuff that the Defense Department says it doesn't need, it comes at the expense of something else. Your point is not a bad one, that there are times where in doing that, it has an impact on the industrial base that at some point, maybe long down into the future, you may need again, and that could come at a cost. And so I don't disagree with that point. I was just trying to give an example of there are times where the problem isn't just the Defense Department. The problem is also Congress choosing to buy things that the Defense Department says it doesn't need.
Joe Reisman, how would you like to see Congress move forward with health care at this point?
Yeah. We have been, I think for 7 years, we've seen this sort of chaos with regard to attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. You know, you had people say, well, you know, just put us in charge of everything, we'll repeal the Affordable Care Act and we'll make everything sunshine and rainbows and fix every problem within healthcare. That's not true. What you've seen proposed in Congress on pretty much every metric would have made healthcare worse, not better, unfortunately. That's not Derek Kilmer saying it, it's the nonpartisan independent Congressional Budget Office, which says at best the proposals that were put forward in Congress would cut 14 million people off of their health care, and at worst would cut 24 million people off of their health care. You heard the president as a candidate say, no one's going to be worse off under our proposal. Well, tell that to the person between age 60 and 64, who according to the Congressional Budget Office would see their premiums increase 8 to 9 times over under the House Republican proposal. You know, tell that to people with pre-existing conditions. You know, listen, I sat at the Community Health Center on the hilltop of Tacoma, and I had a woman say to me, you know what, I have cancer, and I only have insurance because of the Medicaid expansion that occurred under the Affordable Care Act. And she said, you know, I have pre-existing conditions, and yet I still have insurance and I'm able to get the care that I need. And she said, Derek, for me, this is life or death. You know, and so I have to tell you, one of the bluest days I've had in this job was watching my colleagues on the other side of the aisle high five and jump for joy. And literally, I saw with my own eye people carrying kegs of beer into the Capitol building to celebrate the passage of a House Republican health care bill that would absolutely hammer the people I represent. And it makes me mad because it would really hurt the people I represent. And I've talked to a lot of them. I believe that the focus on healthcare should be about solving healthcare problems, not solving political problems. So what do we do? I wasn't in Congress when the Affordable Care Act was passed. I don't think it's a perfect law. Now, there are, and I mentioned a few of them, it has undeniably made progress on a number of fronts for the people I represent, but it's not a perfect law. So I actually prepared a slide to get specifically to your question of what's next. I'm going to spare you some of this, but you can see what I would present to you if you were interested. So this gets on what do we do next? So the good news is that with the failure of the Senate Republican health care proposal, for the first time, we've had some Republicans come to the table and say, okay, let's get off of this repeal conversation. Let's embrace the parts that work, and let's fix the parts that need fixing. And so a bipartisan group of us have put forward a proposal that says, let's try to fix some of those parts that need fixing. So one of the key areas to start that focus is on shoring up the individual marketplace. And that starts with guaranteeing the cost sharing reductions. This is what, if you're going to cover people with pre-existing conditions, this is what helps mitigate the risk of doing that so that you can afford to provide health care to poor and sick people. Unfortunately, in recent months, you've heard the president say, well, maybe we're not going to provide those cost-sharing reduction payments. What he's saying when he says that is we're not going to provide health insurance to sick people. And I disagree with him. And thankfully, you now have not just Democrats, but also some Republicans who have said we should guarantee those cost-sharing reductions. In addition, the notion of reinsurance to try to, again, mitigate risk associated with premium increases is something that would pump the brakes on those premium increases. Simply by putting those cost-sharing reductions at risk, this isn't Derek Kilmer saying it, this is independent actuaries saying it, it has, just in this next round of expected insurance premiums, led to double-digit increases, just because Congress and the President have suggested maybe they won't provide those. Second, we should use the tax code. I met with, when I worked in economic development, I met with about 200 businesses a year. Most of them provided insurance to their employees, but those that didn't, it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was because they couldn't afford to. And so I've sponsored bills that said, let's provide them some help through the tax codes, so they can actually cover their employees without bearing an enormous financial burden. Third, primary care. The good news of the Affordable Care Act is it attached a bunch of people into the healthcare system. The bad news is we don't have enough primary care providers. And so I've sponsored a number of bills that say, let's try to encourage people who are in medical school to go into primary care, and specifically let's provide things like student debt relief if they're willing to go into primary care in an area like Mason County that needs more primary care providers. In addition, you see on that slide up there another acronym, I'm sorry for that. ACO stands for Accountable Care Organization. That's something that the Affordable Care Act did that I think was actually kind of smart, and it was an attempt to move away from a fee-for-service model toward one that's focused on patient wellness. The idea is under fee-for-service, one of the downsides is in a fee-for-service model, your medical providers get paid when they do stuff to you. And that incents them to do more stuff to you, to do more tests and procedures and that type of thing. The Accountable Care Organization model moves away from that and tries to keep patients out of emergency rooms and out of doctors' offices and focus more on patient wellness. Now here's something the Affordable Care Act did wrong. Under that ACO model, under the Affordable Care Act, it is not a reimbursable event if you go to a primary care provider who's not an MD. If you go to a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, that is not considered a reimbursable event under the ACO model of the Affordable Care Act. So I've introduced a bill to fix that, because that particularly affects rural communities where, listen, my wife's primary care provider is a nurse practitioner. You know, in a lot of rural areas, we don't have a lot of primary care docs, but we have nurse practitioners and physician assistants. And so we've got a bill to fix that. Now, interestingly, that too is a bipartisan bill. I'm the lead sponsor of it, and the co-sponsor of it is a conservative Republican from Kansas who also represents a bunch of rural areas who's negatively impacted by the status quo. In addition, so those first 3 bullet points up there are things that I think you could actually get bipartisan support for. The last one's a tougher sell, and that is we have had a market-based approach to health care, but sometimes economists would tell you you have market failures. We almost saw that earlier this year when insurers said maybe we won't provide, maybe no insurer will provide policies in Grace Harbor County, which is also in the district we all live in. That's a market failure. I would argue that argues the point for providing a public option, enabling people to buy, and then also that enabling people to buy into Medicare so that they aren't left, I mean, as Grace Harbor County almost was, completely stranded. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's something that I support. I can't tell you that that's likely to happen in this Congress, but I think it makes sense. I don't see my team.
Hi, Derek. So Belfair.
I think you're our last question.
Okay, great. It's a quick one. There's a lot of things about our government and country that I don't like, and there's a lot of things I do like. But there's 3 things I'd like to see gotten rid of. And I'm wondering if you could give us a report, as one of our politicians, if there's any movement on ridding us of the Electoral College, if there's any movement on ridding us of the Patriot Act, and be it the 25th Amendment, this seated president.
Good. 3 quick questions. I'll go in reverse order. Listen, the impeachment question you asked, I think the I words that I'm focused on are investigation and information. Part of the reason you have a special counsel that's investigating what has happened is to get the facts out, see who did what, and I will tell you if those facts suggest that there are people, regardless of how high they are up in office, who broke the law, there should be consequences for breaking the law. Period. No one should be above the law. Not the president or anybody else. Second, with the Patriot Act, I actually think it's very important that we do a better job of threading the needle between protecting American citizens and protecting American citizens' civil liberties. And so I've been a big advocate for, at the very least, reforming our intelligence agencies' ability to collect information so that when that happens, they have to, for example, get a court order and justify their desire for information. Again, and there's some people who say, well, we have to balance that, or I don't think it's choosing one or the other. We have to do both. We have to both protect the American people and protect your privacy and civil liberties. Third, the Electoral College. There's nothing really happening in Congress on that, but there is something happening in our country on that. There is something called an interstate compact on the national popular vote. Our state, the state of Washington, is party to that interstate compact. It actually became party to that interstate compact when I was in the state legislature. This gets super wonky really quick, but I'm going to try to explain it in a way that hopefully makes some sense. What that interstate compact says is, I think it takes 218 electoral votes, right? Is that right? What's the number?
270.
Yeah, 270, you got it.
218 is majority.
Yeah, that's how many it takes to pass a bill in Congress. So 270 electoral votes to elect the president. What that interstate compact says is when you get enough states signed onto it to equal 270 electoral votes, all of those states will commit their electors to supporting the winner of the national popular vote. Does that make sense? So our state is party to that, and you now have enough states signed up to it. I think that it equals like 165 electoral votes. So if you want to see action on that, I guess my encouragement would be you can go online and look at what states are and are not signed up for it. Our state already is. And call your friends who live in states that aren't signed up to it and have them call their legislators. I wish I supported that interstate compact. I would support having the national popular vote be the determinant of who is our president.
You could offer that, bring that to the floor, maybe.
It won't pass in this Congress. So I'll wait until you're all done. But I appreciate the question, and certainly believe in reference to the comment in the back of the room. If Congress doesn't get its act together, I think you're going to see a lot of terms limited. And that's the power you all have as citizens. I'm sorry, I tried to respond to you. Listen, I know we've reached well past the witching hour. Thanks for hanging in there. Most importantly, thanks for caring enough about your country to spend 95 minutes with your member of Congress. Listen, I'm a firm believer in what Abraham Lincoln said. Lincoln said public sentiment is everything. You may like or dislike what's going on in our nation's capital. You may see that there are bad laws that are being proposed and good laws that are being proposed for repeal. But no one in our nation's capital can repeal the laws of physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If you are unhappy with something happening in our nation's capital, there's an opportunity for an opposite reaction. Let your voice be heard. I'm very grateful that many of you have done that by showing up here tonight. My encouragement to you is keep the faith. Please stay engaged. If I can just underscore the two things I said at the beginning of the room. I want the members of my team to raise their hands. All of these people work for you. I would reiterate, if you've got an issue with the federal government, or if you think there's something that we should be working on, I'd love to hear from you. With that, I'm going to call it a night. Again, I apologize that I'm going to dash out of the room because I really would love to see my kids before they fall asleep. So, thanks everybody.